The Civil War, North and South, Part 2. As the war dragged on, the Confederate government demanded greater and greater sacrifices from its people to keep on fighting. Those sacrifices fell disproportionately and unfairly on the poor white non-slaveholders of the South, the bulk of the Southern population. The poor whites of the South were called on to make the greatest sacrifices, yet they had the least to gain from a war to protect slavery. Increasingly, the poor whites of the South felt it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And that is a price the non-slaveholders of the South were not willing to pay to preserve slavery. So how is it that the poor were asked to sacrifice more than the rich to fight the war? Well, the Confederate draft is a good example. The Confederate military draft. In 1862, the Confederate government began drafting men into the Army. The Confederate government drafted all white men between the ages of 18 and 35. 2 years later, in 1864, the Confederates extended the draft to all white men between the ages of 16 and 50. And so the Confederate government was drafting old men, young boys, and everything in between. You can begin to see why 1/4 of Southern white men died during the war. The Confederate government also exempted men from the draft. You were exempt from the draft if you owned 20 slaves. In fact, you'd get one exemption from the draft for every 20 slaves that you owned. Suppose you own 100 slaves. You don't have to go fight, and your 4 sons don't have to go fight. Now, why would the Confederacy enact an exemption like that? Well, the logic was somebody's got to stay home on the plantation and act as overseer to make sure that the slaves keep working, because that's the labor force that's growing food to feed Southern armies. And so you got to exempt one white guy for every 20 slaves you own. And so the Confederate draft hit the lower classes the hardest, the poor white non-slaveholders. For the poor white non-slaveholding farm family, the presence of the father was vital to the survival of the family as a whole. Remember when we talked about the household economy? Every member of the family makes a vital economic contribution. If the father got drafted, that could mean starvation for the whole family. The bottom line, on a family farm, losing one man's labor is a big, big deal. On a big plantation, one man's labor, not that important. On a big plantation, losing one man's labor is no big deal. And so the draft hit the poor whites of the South the hardest. But now who gets exempted from the draft? The wealthy planter gets exempted from the draft. One exemption for every 20 slaves you own. And again, there's logic to it. Somebody's got to stay behind and act as overseer. But that's not how the poor whites of the South saw it. What the poor whites of the South saw is, this is a war over slavery? And the rich slaveholder doesn't have to go fight? That just stinks. That is rotten to the core. And so the poor whites, they came up with their own name for the Confederate draft. They started calling it the 20 Negro Law. You got 20 Negroes? You don't need to go fight. Confederate taxation also hit the poor whites of the South the hardest. When a country goes to war, there's 3 ways to pay for it. You can borrow, the government can borrow, the government can tax, the government can just crank up the printing presses and start printing money. Confederate taxation fell hardest on the poor whites of the South. All of the taxes enacted by the Confederacy were flat taxes. A flat tax is where everybody pays the same rate, regardless of income. It's very different from our federal income tax today, where the more you make, the higher the rate you pay. But the Confederate taxes were all flat taxes. Flat taxes are really hard on poor people because you barely have enough money to scrape by, and you're getting taxed at the same rate as rich people who have lots of money left over for luxuries. Now suppose you don't have enough cash to pay the tax bill. No problem. The Confederacy had a problem for that, had a solution for that rather. It was called the tax in kind. If you can't pay in cash, then the government seizes your property. That is, the tax man comes to your farm and he takes away your personal possessions, maybe your milk cow and your farm tools. You paid the tax. The other way the Confederacy financed the war was simply cranking up the printing press and printing money. And if the government does that, the result, in the end, will be inflation. But what is inflation but itself a form of taxation that hits poor people the hardest? Poor people are barely scraping by, and then the price of everything is doubling and tripling. Inflation clobbers poor people. So the war burdened the poor whites of the South the most. And the result of being given that unfair burden? Many poor whites began to turn their backs against the Confederacy. Many poor white Southerners became openly hostile to their own Confederate government. As the war progressed and the hardship increased, more and more Southern soldiers began to desert from Confederate armies. Now, there was a pattern to the desertion, and it would go like this. The poor white Confederate soldiers, they would be sitting in camp, and they'd be bitching and moaning about how it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And then the mail would arrive, and there would be a letter from the soldier's wife. And the letter would say something like this. Honey, I've run out of money. The children are starving. I can't pay the tax bill. The tax man has come and taken our milk cow and our farm tools away. I don't know what to do next. I need help. You need to quit playing war and come home and take care of your family. Now, if you're a Confederate soldier, and you already feel it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, and then you find out your family is starving, you're going to be tempted to desert. To hell with the Confederacy, I need to take care of my family. More and more Confederate soldiers began to desert. By late 1864, one half of the Confederate Army was AWOL. Now, this desertion that I'm talking about should not be confused with being pro-Union or pro-North or pro-Lincoln. These Confederate deserters were anti-Confederate. What they wanted to do was go home, take care of their families, and be left alone. And it wasn't Lincoln and the North who was bugging them. It was their own Confederate government in Richmond who was bugging them. Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy. With the draft, the flat taxes, the tax in kind, the inflation, and so on. Now, back on the Southern home front. Remember all those rich planters who were exempt from the draft? They formed local military groups called Home Guards to try and round up the deserters and get them back into the army. And so the deserters went into hiding. If the Home Guard couldn't find a deserter, they'd go after the deserter's family. And they would torture or punish the family until they told where the deserter was hiding out. Pretty soon, all the deserters set out to avenge themselves. The deserters organized themselves into their own military units, or bands, for their own mutual protection, and they took the law into their own hands. These bands of deserters became known as outliers, groups of deserters from the Confederate Army who organized to defend themselves against the Home Guards. The outliers fought guerrilla style. They hid out in the woods and attacked the Home Guards. And so pretty soon you had bands of outliers terrorizing the Confederate countryside. Pretty soon what you have is a civil war taking place within the Confederacy. Southerner against Southerner. A civil war within a civil war. And so sometimes it's called the Inner Civil War. And it was pretty much a class war. Rich, pro-Confederates against poor anti-Confederates. It was intermittent early in the war. It became chronic late in the war. And this inner civil war was especially bad in the mountainous areas of the South where most of the poor whites lived. Western Virginia, Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, and Northern Georgia. Now, if you've ever read the novel Cold Mountain, or seen the film starring Nicole Kidman, Jude Law, and Renee Zellweger, you know what I'm talking about. Cold Mountain takes place in the western North Carolina mountains, and it's all about the inner Civil War with the Home Guards and the outliers. In some areas of the South, the Confederate government completely lost control of the situation. There were some areas of the South where it was actually dangerous for a loyal Confederate to show his face. There are some parts of the South where the outliers put the Home Guards on the run. Now, when local Confederate authorities lost control of the situation, they had to appeal for help to the main Confederate government in Richmond. Let me just give you one example of how bad a problem this became for the Confederacy. In the winter of 1865, Robert E. Lee and the South, they were making their last desperate stand against Ulysses Grant and the North outside Richmond. At that moment, Robert E. Lee needed every soldier he could get. Every man was precious. But at that moment, the violence in the North Carolina mountains between the Home Guards and the outliers became so severe that Lee had to detach 500 precious troops and send them south into the North Carolina mountains to try and restore order. And when Lee's men got to the North Carolina mountains, they were completely overwhelmed. The Confederacy never regained control of the North Carolina mountains. And so again, if you're familiar with Cold Mountain, you know what I'm talking about. Cold Mountain is a novel, historical fiction. It takes place in the North Carolina mountains. It's about the inner Civil War and the outliers versus the Home Guards.